Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you ever noticed how school, which should be a place of learning, sometimes turns into a courtroom of appearances? That's right. Caio wasn't judged for his choices, behavior, or ideas. He was judged for acne, crooked teeth, and broken glasses. While others grew through compliments, he learned to swallow the laughter of others and the pain of being invisible. All because he didn't look like the lead in a victorious story. But let me tell you something few people understand. It's not always the pretty ones who shine first. Sometimes it's those who've endured the most darkness. And Caio, he was forged in rejection, ignored in tryouts, mocked in the hallways, dismissed by his own teachers. But do you know what he did while everyone pointed fingers? He trained, quietly, alone, in secret, because what was shame to many became the root of one of the most emotional turnarounds school basketball had ever seen. Get ready, because this isn't just a story of overcoming. It's a lesson in perception and transformation, and in how to use rejection as a tool to change the game. And in Caio's case, changing the game was just the beginning. In those crowded hallways where looks seemed to matter more than character, Caio walked as if he were invisible. The acne, the crooked teeth, and the glasses taped together made him an easy target. Classmates wasted no time with cruelty masked as jokes, and the saddest part, even some teachers would look away as if he didn't exist. It's strange how, in some places, being outside the standard becomes an unspoken crime. And in the middle of that silent judgment, a story was about to be born, and no one noticed. Caio wasn't the kind of student who caused trouble or sought attention. He just wanted to belong. But even that simple wish felt unreachable. On the day he signed up for basketball tryouts, the scene was so sad it was almost comical. He barely stepped onto the court, and the stairs already pushed him back to the bleachers. No test, no chance. As if his broken glasses said more about him than his tactical intelligence. And this isn't just about Caio. How many stories have you heard of being buried by labels that said nothing about who someone truly was? But there's something no one can predict: hidden value. While everyone was busy laughing, Caio was watching. He analyzed plays, studied timing, and saw the game the way a conductor sees a symphony. An unnoticed talent is like a buried gem. It may be covered in dirt, but it's still valuable. And often the most powerful stories start just like this, dismissed by all, but sustained by a silent faith that doesn't ask permission. It just keeps going. In the weeks that followed, he started training in secret. He'd head to the back court, where the cement was cracked and the lone streetlight flickered. Carrying an old ball under his arm became routine. Every shot was a conversation with the future. Every dribble, a reply to the jokes. And there, in anonymity, a story of discipline was born. No one saw, no one clapped, but he kept going. Because sometimes the stage for transformation has no audience, only courage. And strangely enough, even without encouragement, he never stopped. He studied game footage on an old phone, copied moves into a notebook, and made every session a mission. While others sought approval, he sought evolution. And that changes everything. It's like saying to the world, I don't need to be seen now, I just need to be ready when the chance shows up. Many stories die because recognition comes too late. But Caio understood early that being great in silence is the best long-term investment. And fate, which loves to surprise, decided to step in. A PE teacher, tired of the same excuses during class, took a walk after hours. Passing by the backcourt, he saw Caio training. He stopped, watched, and for the first time, someone truly saw him. Quietly, he recorded a short clip on his phone. That raw, unedited footage carried more than talent. It carried truth. It carried a story still being written. The video was posted without expectations, almost as an act of kindness. But the internet, when it senses something real, reacts. And it did. Comments started trickling in. Who's this kid? How did no one see this before? Within days, the video went viral. Suddenly, Caio was being talked about in athlete groups and sports forums, basketball pages. Scouts started asking. Retired players shared the link emotionally. Because stories like these, born from pain and blooming in truth, reach even the most skeptical hearts. Then came the invitation. A state-level tryout with the best student athletes in the circuit. Caio could barely believe it. He arrived with the same torn sneakers, the patched-up backpack, and the look of someone who'd been rejected 1,000 times. But now all eyes were on him. And when the ball was tipped, he didn't need flashy dunks or crazy moves. He simply showed what he always had: game vision, calm, consistency, as if to say, "I'm here, I've always been." And another story was written, this time in permanent ink. He was named the best player of the tournament. The invisible boy had become a role model, but the most beautiful part was how he handled it. He went back to school without boasting. He wanted to give a talk, not for glory, for awareness. He got on stage and showed old photos, read the nicknames that once hurt him, not as revenge, as testimony. Then he said the line that now lives on the school's mural: "I didn't become handsome, I became necessary." And once again, he proved that the stories that heal are the ones that face the past with love, not hate. Inspired by everything he lived through, Caio decided to start a project. He called it Beyond the Look, a space for support, self-esteem, and basketball. The goal? To train young people who, like him, had been underestimated for their appearance. The project's key feature was simple and profound. Before picking up a ball, students would write letters to themselves listing their qualities. It was more than physical training. It was emotional development. And with listening and empathy, new stories were born on the same ground where there had once been only rejection. Years later, a documentary was made. The Invisible Boy toured festivals, won awards, and became required school viewing. But what moved people wasn't Caio's highlight reel. It was the symbolism. A boy once mocked for being ugly had become a symbol for wholeness. The message was clear: no one is too small when greatness lives within. And the most revolutionary stories aren't the ones that end in trophies. They're the ones that start in silence. They called Caio the team mascot, with that sarcastic laugh that left no doubt. It wasn't affection, it was disguised disdain. The kind of joke that even without profanity cut deeper than any insult. And the worst part? No one even thought twice before mocking him. It was automatic, instinctive, as if his pain were part of the daily menu, a dose of entertainment to break up practice. That wasn't just bullying. It was systematic devaluation, a daily dismantling of self-esteem, all disguised as just kidding. And when that repeats every day, the soul begins to wither, because sooner or later we start to believe what they say about us. And that's when many stories never begin, not for lack of talent, but for excess of judgment. Caio tried to smile. Sometimes he even laughed along to avoid the shame of seeming hurt. But inside, every laugh from others was like a sharp blade carving a new scar. It was a pain that didn't bleed, but left marks. Even the bench warmers who barely saw court time avoided sitting near him, as if they were protecting their own image, afraid of being contaminated by his strange looks, his crooked glasses, his withdrawn demeanor. The truth is hard. We live in a society that measures worth by the outside, by stereotypes, by aesthetic conformity. And in this cruel system, Caio was invisible. Invisible like so many others whose stories never bloom because no one has the sensitivity to look deeper. But what no one saw was that Caio viewed the game differently. While they mocked, he observed. While others spent energy on jokes, he used his to learn. At home, the TV was his coach. Game videos were his textbooks. The remote control, his pencil. He paused every play, analyzed positioning, mapped decisions, studied how Chris Paul created space, how Rajon Rondo read passing lanes, and he wrote everything in an old, torn notebook, its pages glowing with the brilliance of someone who sees what doesn't yet exist. There, in the silence of his room, a story was being born, unseen by all, yet written with force, focus, and faith. The truth is, Caio didn't train to impress. He trained to understand. He was in love with the game, not the spotlight. He knew he lacked explosiveness, strength, aesthetics, but he also knew he had something untrainable: vision. He could foresee plays. He knew where each player should be before the ball even left the passer's hand. That doesn't come from flashy skills, it comes from listening, from silence, from devotion. That's why so many incredible stories are born far from applause. Because they're forged in solitary persistence, in the phase when no one believes in you, not even yourself sometimes. And it was right at that point that everything began to change. During a regular practice, the coach asked for a fast break drill. One of the starting guards twisted his ankle, and without thinking, the coach called out, "Caio, get in." There were snickers. Someone whispered, "Here comes the mascot." But he went in and did the unexpected. He didn't try to shine. He just organized. made accurate passes, controlled the pace, pointed out rotations. In 2 minutes, chaos turned into symphony. The coach stood in silence, watching. And right there, the first visible chapter of a story that had long been in the making began. But no one had noticed until now. After practice, the coach pulled Caio aside. It wasn't to praise him. It was to ask. He wanted to understand how Caio had done what he did. Caio explained his notes, his studies, his videos. He showed the notebook. And for the first time, someone truly listened to him. The coach was speechless. He simply said, "You have the eyes of a coach." And in that intimate and unlikely moment, the seed of transformation was watered with respect. Because when someone truly sees us, our story starts to change. From that day on, Caio was included in tactical training sessions. He still wasn't a starter, but he began to influence the game from the sidelines. He gave tips, corrected positions, pointed out mistakes no one else noticed. Some teammates began to listen. Others still laughed. But that didn't matter much anymore, because Caio had discovered something precious. His worth wasn't tied to the acceptance of others, but to his coherence with who he knew he was. And that changes everything, because the most powerful stories are born from truth, not vanity. Over time, he earned his place. He played a few minutes in friendly matches, made surgical assists. He was never the top scorer, never made a flashy dunk, never stole the spotlight. But wherever he was on the court, the team flowed better. Opposing coaches began asking about that strange kid who orchestrated the game with the poise of a veteran, and his name, once a punchline, started circulating in different circles. One of those conversations reached the ears of a regional scout, who decided to watch a game out of curiosity. And he saw the same thing Caio had seen all along. Talent doesn't have a look, it has consistency. The scout didn't waste time. He called a contact at a state training center and recommended Caio for a tryout. It was his chance. But Caio hesitated. He was scared of showing up and being judged all over again. Scared of discovering that everything he had built in silence wouldn't be enough in the face of cruel standards of appearance. It was his mother who said, "You already won the moment you chose not to give up." And with that sentence, Caio went. The tryout was tough. Athletes with perfect uniforms, expensive shoes, sculpted bodies. And there he was, with his old backpack, patched-up glasses, and the same worn-out sneakers as always. But on the court, none of that mattered. What counted was his intelligence, his effort, his game sense. And at the end of the week, the news came. Caio had been selected. Not for his looks, not for media appeal, but for merit. And right there, through quiet tears, a new chapter was born in a story that once had been nothing but a joke. Today, Caio is a role model, not because of what he achieved, but because of how he achieved it. He founded a sports training institute that bears his name and his philosophy, a space where no one is judged by appearance, where each young person is seen as potential, not product. There, he teaches more than basketball. He teaches vision, respect, resilience. And every time someone asks him for the secret, he answers simply, "While you were mocking me, I was studying. While you rejected me, I was building. And now, while you applaud me, I'm shaping others." While his classmates left school looking for snacks, laughs, or another round of mockery in group chats, Caio went a different way. Quietly, almost invisibly, he headed to a place no one else cared to go, a cracked concrete court hidden behind the main gym. It was a forgotten corner, with faded court lines and a crooked light pole trying to shine with its flickering yellow glow. But to Caio, that wasn't an abandoned space. It was a sanctuary, a place where he didn't need permission to exist. There, in the anonymity of that worn-out ground, he became someone else. He became who he really was, and who he was still becoming. Because every dribble, every shot, every failed attempt repeated until it worked, was a silent conversation with the future. And on that ground of rejection, a new story was being built. With sweat, discipline, and patience. Caio didn't carry applause. He carried a patched ball, an old phone with a cracked screen, and a backpack that looked like it might fall apart any minute. Inside it, a spiral notebook full of notes. Not video game strategies or doodles, but tactical schemes, movement observations, notes on how professional players positioned themselves, passed or shot. Caio studied videos, paused every play, noted blocking angles, timing, wrist rotation. It bordered on obsession, but a beautiful one. Born when no one bets on you, but you choose to invest anyway. While most were chasing likes, he was chasing coherence. And that, in any field, is gold. Want to know why? Because when you're true to yourself, you don't need an audience. The invisible becomes fertile ground. And it was there that he learned. The most solid stories aren't born under spotlights. They're born in the dark, watered with persistence. Every day after class, Caio repeated the routine. He propped his phone up on a pile of old books, leaned it against his backpack, and hit record. Then he began to train. He repeated the same move dozens of times, then watched the footage at night searching for flaws, adjusting angles. He invented drills with whatever he had, used plastic bottles as cones, drew on the ground with chalk, marked shooting spots with bottle caps. And the most surprising part? He did it all without any promise of recognition. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about discovering himself. When the court became a mirror, he realized that every step, every drop of sweat, every scrape on his knee was an answer. And the best stories are exactly those. The ones born when the only person who believes is you. While others ignored him, laughed, or thought he was odd, Caio was building something invisible to the eye, but enormous inside, repertoire, and that no one could take away. The plays he practiced weren't random. They were calculated decisions. Inspired by sports idols, yes, but adapted to his body, his limitations, his way of thinking. He wasn't the fastest, nor the strongest, but he could read the game. He knew how to take space, how to anticipate. All of it was being shaped on that peeling court, with a ball that bounced crooked. That place once overlooked became a laboratory, a center of silent creation. And that's a powerful reminder. The setting doesn't define the greatness of the story. It's the intention of the one inside it that does. More than training skills, Caio was training identity. It wasn't just about learning basketball. It was about learning to listen to himself, to respect himself, to keep going even without a cheering crowd. Every day in that forgotten corner was a message to the soul. I don't need to be accepted to begin. I just need to begin. And that is one of the most valuable lessons anyone can learn. Because if you're waiting to be invited to show what you can do, you might be missing the most fertile time of your life. And by understanding this, Caio's story stopped being just another among many. It became a metaphor. It became a symbol. And later, an inspiration. Do you love music but no one invites you to perform? Record your versions in your room. Sing to the mirror. Post your interpretations. Do you draw but no one commissions your work? Share your sketches. Create a profile. Show your evolution. Because if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that what's invisible today can become indispensable tomorrow. The problem is that too many people wait to be seen before taking action, when in fact action is what shapes the way others see us. Caio was never picked for school teams. He never heard cheers from the bleachers. But there, in the darkness of that improvised court, he was becoming inevitable. With every training session, it became harder and harder to ignore him. And like every good story, the turning point came. But curiously, it didn't arrive with fireworks or standing ovations. It happened when a PE teacher decided to stay a bit longer at school, and walking past the back court, heard the sound of a dribble, over and over. Curious, he went over and saw Caio training alone, as always. He stood in silence, watching, filmed a few seconds with his phone, more out of respect than for show, and he posted it. But unlike the hundreds of funny or trendy videos, that clip hit differently. It was raw, real, full of purpose. It felt like it was saying, look at this. Look at this story that was hidden. The post went viral, not because of editing, not because of marketing, but because it was real. And when something is genuine, the internet senses it. The comments came in waves. How did no one see this kid before? This is real talent. He plays with soul. Scouts started asking questions. Coaches got interested. But the most beautiful part was Caio's reaction. He didn't get starstruck. He kept training. He kept studying. He kept being himself. Because when a story is built in silence, the noise of fame doesn't scare you. It only amplifies what already existed. And that's when the real transformation began. Not just for him, but for everyone watching. Young people who also felt invisible started sending messages. I'm ashamed of my body too, but now I'll give it a try. I used to hide, but after seeing your story, I went to my school court. That's when Caio realized he wasn't just playing basketball. He was planting a future. He was silently declaring that everyone has the right to exist, to try, to be taken seriously, even when no one is watching. Because in the end, the deepest stories don't shout. They echo. It happened by chance, like many great things do. A tired PE teacher, fed up with the monotony of the school day, decided not to go straight home. That day, the weight of routine hit differently, so he wandered through the empty school, trying to reconnect with the purpose that made him want to teach. Passing the old back court, the one almost no one used, he heard the lonely bounce of a ball. Curious, he approached quietly and saw the scene. Caio, the quiet kid from class, training alone. There was no one in the stands, no friends cheering, no coach shouting, just the sound of effort, the focus, sweat dripping down his face, and the expression of someone not seeking applause, just growth. The teacher stood still, watching, as if witnessing something too rare to interrupt. That presence on the court, that steady gaze without an audience revealed more than physical skill. It was raw emotional intelligence, silent dedication, the kind of thing you don't teach, you uncover. Right there, with no rehearsals, no spotlights, a new story was beginning to take shape. Moved by a sincere impulse, the teacher pulled out his phone and recorded. No edits, no music, no filter, just Caio, in his truest form. It was a record of truth, the kind you make like a note to the future, not knowing it might become a book. When he posted the video, he expected nothing, maybe a few likes, a comment or two. But the internet, that unpredictable entity, has a radar for what's real. And when a story has soul, it doesn't need to scream. It whispers deeply and reaches where it needs to. At first, the comments came slowly. A few compliments, a handful of likes. But soon it snowballed into something no one expected. Who is this kid? Why haven't we heard of him? That's raw talent. Former athletes, coaches, journalists, influencers, all shared the same amazement and the same question. How did a boy with that level of court vision, body awareness, and composure go unnoticed? The answer was painful and familiar. Appearance. Because many stories are ignored not for lack of value, but for excess of labeling. The most touching part, Caio didn't even know he was going viral. He kept going to school with the same torn backpack, the same worn-out shoes, the same quiet demeanor, until, during a break, a friend ran up to him breathless, phone trembling in hand. "Dude, look at this," and showed him the video. Caio watched silently. At first he thought it was some prank, a joke. Then he saw the comments, the shares, and for the first time, he saw his effort take shape beyond anonymity. That was his story, finally being told, not with words but with recognition. In that moment, everything changed. Not on the outside. School was still the same, the halls still noisy, math tests still existed, but something inside him shifted. It was as if that video had unlocked an old door, one he didn't even know he wanted to open. It felt like finding a letter written just for you, by someone who saw you before you even knew you existed. And that feeling, that unexpected validation, rekindled dreams that had been stored away in silence. Offers started coming in. Tryouts, interviews, invitations to youth team evaluations. But Caio stayed grounded. He kept going to school every day, kept training alone, because he knew fame was wind, and what truly sustained his journey was rooted. The teacher, moved by it all, made a point to be there every step of the way, not as a coach, as a guide, as someone who understood that some stories only blossom under the right gaze. What captivated people most in the viral videos wasn't just Caio's athletic ability, it was the way he organized the game, how he thought before he acted, how he made the hard things look effortless while others relied on shouting and brute force. It was like he saw in slow motion what others could only catch in real time. And that, my friend, is a gift, an art, the kind that's born from pain, from practice, and from listening. Because some stories don't come from raw talent. They come from the stubbornness to keep going even when no one believes in you. And the most symbolic part? Many of the classmates who once mocked him started coming around. Some apologized. Others just wanted to be part of a narrative that was now admired. Caio held no grudges, but he didn't pretend to forget either. He welcomed them, but with awareness. He knew his story had only changed because he resisted the urge to quit, and no one could take that away from him. Over time, the video went beyond social media. It became a topic on sports programs, news coverage, a subject in talks about invisible talent and structural prejudice. Schools began showing it as an example of resilience, emotional intelligence, and personal growth. And that's when Caio realized what began as a silent training session had become a legacy. Because the stories born from pain have a strength that instant fame will never match. Today, that teacher is still teaching, but with a different spark in his eyes. Every time he walks past that back court, he smiles. Because there, on a random afternoon, he saw a star before the sky even turned dark. Caio keeps training, now with support, structure, visibility, but without losing the essence, the soul of someone who started in the dark. Because he knows what sustains a story isn't the number of followers or the likes. It's the truth with which it was lived. The invitation came like lightning in a cloudy sky, a state-level tryout, bringing together the top names in student basketball. It was the kind of event Caio used to watch online, rooting for kids who seemed to come from another world. With sponsors, private coaches, custom uniforms, he had none of that. No full kit, no new shoes, just his torn backpack, taped up sneakers, and quiet faith. But he was called, and he went, just like that. Same demeanor, same shy gaze, same weight of someone who had been overlooked so many times. He learned to become his own applause. At the court entrance, while others laughed, filmed videos, and greeted old friends, Caio just took a deep breath. It wasn't arrogance, it was focus. The kind of focus born when no one believes in you, and you learn to believe in yourself. And there, in that flashy, spotlighted environment, he started getting noticed. But not for flashy dunks or showy moves. None of that. What set Caio apart was something that doesn't make highlight reels. His game vision, his decision-making, his precision passing, his off-ball movement. He didn't play to show off. He played to elevate. And that, my friend, can't be measured in stats. Only those who feel it, understand it. While others tried to impress with flashy moves, Caio mastered the basics with excellence. He was like a silent conductor in an orchestra of egos. He took responsibility naturally, corrected teammates without arrogance, and above all, played with the kind of calm that only comes from having failed alone 1,000 times and grown from every mistake. And there, on that court, his story began to find an audience. For the first time, the eyes that once ignored him started to follow his every step. And that wasn't luck, it was consistency. Because great stories don't come from magical moments, but from a series of silent choices. At the end of the tournament came the surprise. Caio was named the best player of the competition. Some were shocked. Others tried to brush it off, saying he had a good day. But those who knew the journey understood. This wasn't coincidence. It was the result. The result of practicing on cracked courts, of running in worn-out shoes, of splitting his lunch to save on bus fare. The result of resilience. While many waited for recognition to start shining, Caio was already shining in the dark. He didn't become someone new that day. He was simply seen for who he had always been. And that's the most beautiful part. Some stories aren't created, they're revealed. After the tournament, the invitations started coming. Clubs, social projects, sponsors. But Caio didn't get dazzled. He kept taking the same bus, helping his mother at home, training with the neighborhood kids. He knew visibility is not identity, and the humility that sustained him in obscurity was the same that kept him grounded in the spotlight. Fame is loud, but character, that's what stands firm, he would say to himself, and that's what set him apart. He knew he was building something bigger than a career. He was building a legacy made of truth, of losses that taught more than wins, of scars that became maps, of stories. You don't just tell, you feel. It's curious how the world changes its stance once it sees you winning. The same people who mocked his quiet ways now tried to get close. The classmates who laughed at his faded shirt now wanted photos. But Caio held no grudge. He understood that the problem was never him. It was the crooked lens through which others viewed him. So he wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking purpose. He knew every new opportunity came with a responsibility to represent those who still hadn't been seen. And that awareness made him monumental, because the most powerful stories aren't the ones that only serve the author, but those that clear the path for others. One day, in an interview, he was asked how it felt to receive the award. Caio paused for a few seconds and replied, "I felt relief, because I already knew who I was. I just needed someone else to see it too." That sentence had more impact than the award itself. It was the honest reflection of someone who had lived for years between scorn and resilience. And if you've ever been through that, you know, recognition isn't vanity. It's repair. It's emotional justice. It's telling yourself it was worth not giving up. Because deep down, everyone carries a story that just needs space to bloom. And if you think this is far from your reality, think again. Maybe you're also training in the dark. Maybe your painting is still covered by an invisible cloth. Maybe no one has noticed your strengths, your efforts, your powerful silences. But that doesn't invalidate who you are. On the contrary, it strengthens you. Because every time you persist without an audience, you are writing one of the strongest stories there is, the one of self-validation. Caio's journey teaches more than game strategies. It teaches the importance of not shaping yourself around others' disdain, of not waiting for acceptance to begin. It shows that the world is quick to judge what it sees, but slow to understand what it doesn't. And in that gap, many give up. But those who persist change the game. Sometimes they change the system. Because being good is not enough. You must be ready when the door opens. And when it does, don't hesitate. Because stories like Caio's don't happen every day. But when they do, they light up not just the court, but the lives of everyone watching. The greatest turning point in anyone's life isn't being applauded. It's no longer needing the applause to keep going. And Caio understood that early on. That's why his mission was never just to win. It was to transform, to inspire, to lift others who, like him, once felt invisible. Today, he says with pride, "If I manage to be seen, so can you." But remember, before being seen, learn to see yourself, and that's worth more than any trophy. When he returned to school, Caio was welcomed like a phenomenon. The same hallways that once echoed with mockery now cleared a path for applause. People who once turned their backs now rushed to ask for selfies. And if it had been anyone else, they might have been swept up by it all. But Caio was different. He had spent too long being invisible to now be dazzled by the spotlight. Contrary to what they expected, he didn't arrive beaming. He arrived calm, confident, with the kind of presence that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And when he agreed to give a talk at school, he had one condition. He wanted to tell the truth, the whole truth. No embellishments, no cliches, no performance. He wanted it to be one of those stories that don't just move you. They rebuild you from within. On the big day, the gym was packed. Teachers, students, staff, everyone wanted to see the boy from the documentary. The silence was heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath. When Caio stepped onto the stage, no one knew what to expect, but he knew exactly what he was about to do. He started by showing old photos, his face covered in inflamed acne, his glasses taped together, his training shirt torn at the shoulders. The discomfort was instant. People lowered their eyes, others held back tears. It was as if each image shattered an excuse, a cruel laugh, a harsh judgment. Then he did something even more powerful. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began reading out loud some of the nicknames he'd been called during his school years. Not as someone seeking pity, but as someone carrying a survival certificate. Scarecrow, mutant, walking sunscreen, 4 broken eyes. Each nickname came with a pause, with a silence that screamed louder than any word. And then, looking straight at the audience, he said, "I didn't become handsome. I became necessary." It was as if time stood still, as if that phrase, so simple, so precise, had pierced through the superficial layer of everyone there. And in that moment, a new story began to heal the old one. Because Caio wasn't there for revenge. He didn't want to throw his success in anyone's face. He wanted to turn memories into bridges. He wanted the next teenager rejected for their looks to have a different path. That's why, even after all his achievements, he decided to return to school. Not as a hero, but as a bridge. Not to be admired, but to provoke reflection. Because stories that heal don't end with applause. They continue through action. As he spoke, Caio shared a specific day, years before, when he came home crying after being denied entry to the school's basketball team. He remembered his mother trying to console him, his father telling him to let it go. But what no one knew was that that night, he wrote a letter to himself. A letter that said, "They might not see your worth now, but you know who you are. Keep going." That letter, kept for years inside an old notebook, was the one he read aloud at the end of the talk. A symbolic gesture, but one filled with power. Because the most impactful stories aren't the ones that show the happy ending. They're the ones that reveal the backstage of pain, and it didn't stop there. After the speech, Caio stepped off the stage and walked to the edge of the court. There sat a skinny boy hunched over with the same eyes Caio once had, the eyes of someone trying to disappear to avoid getting hurt. Caio reached out his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "The next story could be yours. Just don't let anyone else write it for you." It was a quiet moment, but it echoed louder than any speech, because someone who has lived the pain of rejection knows exactly where that pain hides in others. In the following days, something began to shift at the school. There was no official announcement, no structural reform, but there was action. A teacher created a student listening group. The administration began revisiting their inclusion policies. And more importantly, the students themselves started watching over one another, learning to support instead of shame. It was as if Caio's words had planted a new unspoken code of conduct, a silent pact of empathy, and all of it didn't come from a resume. It came from a story, and that's where the gold lies. Caio understood that real victory wasn't being applauded. It was making people think. He didn't want to be seen as an exception. He wanted the rule to change. He wanted the next Caio at that school to be treated with dignity from day one. That's more than overcoming. That's social transformation. That's flipping the script without shouting goal. That's rewriting systems without needing to destroy anyone. And you? Have you ever thought about how your story could become a tool for change? Maybe you carry scars that seem too small to share, but don't underestimate the power of your experience. If there's a pain you've overcome, speak it. If there's a bias you've faced, name it. But do it not to boast, but to build. Because well-told stories aren't monuments to one person. They're lighthouses. They're compasses for those still in the dark. Caio moved on with his life after that day. He continued his social projects, his training, his events. But something had changed forever at that school. It wasn't the building or the curriculum, it was the spirit. And that, no one can take away. Because some stories don't need headlines. They spread through glances, gestures, decisions. And the most beautiful one was this. The boy who was mocked for his looks came back, not to shine alone, but to light a fire in others. Caio could have chosen a life of fame, recognition, and a calendar full of speaking gigs. And honestly, it would have been more than deserved. After everything he went through, after all the times he trained in secret, rebuilt himself in silence, and faced prejudice with dignity, the least fate owed him was a bit of glory. But Caio didn't want just that. He didn't see himself as a product of success, but as an agent of change. That's why he refused the pedestal and chose to build bridges. That's when the project Beyond the Face was born, a space that combined self-esteem, listening, and sport. More than training, it was about turning pain into new stories. The name said it all, because Caio knew better than most how much society insists on judging the surface. Skin, marks, features, appearance. And he had already realized that when the world looks at you the wrong way, if you don't have a strong internal foundation, you end up believing the distortions. That's why his mission was clear: build from the inside out. The project wasn't just about basketball, it was about identity. Every ball drill was preceded by reflection. Every physical training session began with a conversation about self-image. There, people trained their bodies and their souls. Because real stories don't grow just through muscles. They grow through purpose. During the weekly sessions, before the first pass or shot, Caio would ask for something different. Each young person had to write a letter to themselves. It wasn't just an exercise. It was a deep dive. "What are you hiding?" he asked. "What part of you has been ignored for so long that even you forgot it existed?" Silence, emotion, confession. In the middle of the court, truths would bloom, ones that even locker rooms couldn't contain. But it was exactly that discomfort that shaped them. Because when a story is buried, it rots. When it's told, it blooms. Many said it felt like therapy, and maybe it was, a collective therapy of reconstruction. Because Caio knew that before he could teach them how to score points, he had to teach them they deserved to be on the court. And that was the hardest part. People who spent their whole lives being told they weren't good-looking enough, good enough, capable enough, arrive already defeated. They apologize for existing. And Caio, with a firm yet warm gaze, would always say, "Here, you don't have to look strong. You just have to allow yourself to grow." And that was the starting point for new stories. The changes were visible. At first, the boys avoided looking in the mirror. Some wouldn't even take off their hoodies. They were afraid of being seen, afraid of being read as failures. But after a few months, those same boys began to lift their chins, look at their reflections with less shame and more care. Because at Beyond the Face, it wasn't about hiding scars. It was about reframing them, about understanding that each mark told a story of resistance. And that was beautiful. That was strength. The project grew. It started with 8 participants, then 15, 30, 50, and Caio made sure to personally know each one. He knew their names, their stories, their fears, and he made a point of showing he wasn't a guru or savior. He was just someone who had once been on the other side and was now willing to walk with them. That made all the difference, because when help comes from someone who truly understands your pain, it doesn't feel like charity, it feels like alliance. And the most impressive part, Caio didn't do any of this for vanity. There was no marketing, no cameras, no sponsorship in those early months. He paid from his own pocket. He used part of what he earned from speaking engagements and advertising campaigns to cover uniforms, basketballs, and transportation. And he didn't tell anyone about it, because it wasn't about applause. It was about mission. Caio wanted to be exactly what he never had, a positive mirror, an adult who looks you in the eye and says, "You have value," because he knew and felt that if he had heard that at 13, many of his wounds would have been different and lighter. Stories might have been possible. That's why every circle of conversation, every training session, every tear shed, there was more than just an activity. It was restoration. It was as if Caio was saying at every meeting, "You are no longer alone." And for those who grew up in the silence of disdain, that meant everything. There, the youth weren't just learning sports techniques. They were gaining a voice, gaining confidence, gaining the right to rewrite their story. Because no one is born small, they just learn to shrink themselves. But they can also learn to expand. And that's what true stories do. They expand. Over time, the transformations moved beyond the court and into families. Parents who once avoided conversations about self-esteem began to cry when they saw their children more confident. Older siblings went back to school, inspired by the youngest's training. Teachers started recommending the project as a space for emotional re-education. The impact was real, visible, and collective, because when a story transforms, it creates waves. And waves don't choose where to hit, they simply reach. Today, Beyond the Face has its own headquarters, institutional support, and a waiting list. But Caio remains the same. With every new group, he repeats one mantra: "You're not here to be accepted, you're here to accept yourself." And that simple yet powerful phrase became the motto painted on the mural at the entrance of the project. Beneath it, dozens of photos of students with a handwritten phrase, "My story deserves to be told," because that's it. Every face, every feature, every journey, all have something to teach. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about what part of your story you're hiding out of shame? Have you thought about how many times you've held back from trying something because you didn't look the part? Maybe like Caio, you also need to create a space. A place where what matters most isn't what others see, but what you believe. Because legacy isn't fame. Legacy is transformation. It's what lives on even after your name fades. And if stories teach us anything, it's that what truly matters endures. Years had passed since the hostile school hallways, since the muffled laughter, the disdainful glances, the subtle shoves, and the invitations that never came. Caio, now a young man recognized for his social work through sports, was different, not just in appearance, but in essence. The once invisible boy had become a reference. He had created a sports project serving hundreds of young people, with structure, mentorship, and above all, listening. Because he knew, some wounds don't heal with time, but with care. It was a simple community event, but loaded with symbolism. Families, children, volunteers, and in the middle of the crowd, a face he'd never forgotten. Not because he wanted to, but because pain has memory. Breno, the same Breno who used to make a point of ignoring him on the training lists, who led the cruel jokes about his appearance, his shy demeanor, his wrinkled clothes, the one who nicknamed him mercilessly and laughed louder when Caio tried to hide his discomfort. But now, time had sculpted a new scene. The Breno Caio saw again looked visibly worn out. He wore a wrinkled shirt, worn-out pants, and a face that carried weight. It was as if he knew this reunion was inevitable, and that, sooner or later, life charges not with revenge, but with reflection. And the reflection he saw at that event said it all. Here was a man who had fallen, and maybe didn't even know how to get up. His eyes held no arrogance, only shame, a silent shame, but deeply audible. Caio could have ignored him, could have pretended not to see, could have turned his back, just as many had done to him. But he chose not to repeat the cycle. He knew the taste of exclusion. He knew how much it hurts to be labeled and rejected. And precisely because of that, his reaction was different. Instead of protecting himself with emotional shields or arming himself with sarcasm, he walked over. He looked Breno in the eyes and firmly asked, "Are you okay?" That simple question hit like a thunderclap. Because those who carry guilt rarely expect compassion, Breno took a while to answer. His eyes welled up. He tried to speak, but the words got stuck. It wasn't a performance of remorse. It was real pain. The pain of someone who realized too late the harm they caused. But Caio wasn't there to judge. He was there to listen. They sat in a quiet corner and talked for a long time. Breno shared his failed attempts, lost jobs, doors closed in his face, the burden of having been someone he no longer recognized. And then came the unthinkable. Caio invited him to work on the project. Not as a player, of course, but as an assistant coach. A place of listening, of help, of learning. A new chance. At first, Breno thought it was a joke, but when he realized it was real, his reaction was one of pure astonishment. "But why?" he asked. And Caio, with calmness, replied, "Because I believe no one should be defined by the worst version of themselves. Life gave me a new story. Maybe it's time for you to write yours too." The scene moved everyone. Not because it was theatrical, but because it was profoundly human. The rejected boy extended a hand to the symbol of his deepest pain. But look, this isn't just about forgiveness. It's about vision. Caio understood that stories that change the world aren't built only with outrage. They also require rebuilding. He wanted more than success. He wanted impact. And he knew that if he wanted to transform the system, he'd have to start with the pieces most broken by it. Breno slowly integrated into the team, at first with insecurity, burdened by the fear of not being accepted. But Caio's project wasn't built on appearances. It was built on purpose, and that changes everything. There, he began learning more than tactics and techniques. He learned about active listening, about vulnerability, about how true new beginnings require humility. Every practice was a chance to teach, but also to be taught. And there, on the same court where he once mocked others, he now taught young people to believe in themselves. Over time, the students themselves came to learn Breno's story, and instead of rejecting him, they began to respect him. Because there is nothing more powerful than someone who owns their mistakes and chooses to do better. He became an example, not of perfection, but of transformation. And Caio continued leading with courage, showing that anyone who truly wants to change realities must be willing to do what few do, see others with new eyes. The community began to change too. The project gained recognition, support from companies, became the subject of a documentary, and was even presented at educational conferences. But what impressed most wasn't the physical structure. It was the emotional foundation holding everything together, a place where every scar was embraced, where every pain became raw material for resilience, where difficult stories found new endings, or better yet, new beginnings. There was a mural in the center of the space where the youth could write inspiring phrases. One day a phrase appeared unsigned, but it became the motto. Here, we don't erase the past. We rewrite it with new attitudes. That phrase many believe was written by Breno, but it didn't matter who wrote it. What mattered was that it perfectly captured what happened there every day. A space where no one had to pretend they'd never made mistakes, but where everyone was expected to try to be better. Caio understood that stories heal, that when a human being is seen, heard, and respected, they begin to blossom, and that when we choose not to repeat what hurt us, we create something new, something grand. His project kept growing, but its essence remained intact, to offer dignity where there was once neglect. It was as if he'd made a pact with himself. No one will go through what I went through without finding an outstretched hand. And that's what defines legacies. Because fame fades, trophies age. But what's built with empathy, time cannot erode. Caio's story stopped being just about overcoming. It became a platform for others to write their own. Young people who once would have quit at the first no now insisted with courage, because they knew that someone once insisted too, even while being mocked, and won. In the end, it wasn't about Caio or Breno. It was about what can happen when someone chooses to break the cycle of cruelty with a single act of courage, about how stories have the power to intertwine, even when they start on opposite sides, and how true victory isn't silencing those who hurt you, but giving them a chance to listen, to learn, to change. What started as a shaky phone recording with no intention of going viral ended up crossing borders Caio himself never imagined. It was just a simple video of a school basketball game. The camera shook, the audio cut out, but what was happening there was pure truth. Those images of a skinny teenager marked by adolescence and walking timidly, dominating the court without saying a word, touched something no professional lens could ever fabricate, the essence of a real story. What began as mockery, as muffled laughter in the background, became a script. An independent production company searching for new youth overcoming narratives found something powerful in the footage. They decided to investigate. They went to the school, talked to classmates, teachers, coaches, and what they discovered was more than talent with the ball. They found a boy who, even when wounded, chose not to wound, who, even when humiliated, didn't humiliate in return. Caio had every reason to pay back in kind, but he chose to pay with dignity. That was the currency he used to write his story. The documentary, The Invisible Boy, wasn't just screened, it was celebrated. It started small, with a modest showing at a local festival, but kept growing. It gained traction, praise, nominations. It won awards at international festivals, was added to school curricula, and was discussed at universities like Harvard and Oxford. And not because of special effects or high-end production. Its impact came from its raw human core. Because when a story hits deep, it needs no translation. It speaks straight to the soul, and Caio's did, loudly, and on behalf of many. What was most impressive wasn't the technical talent or the highlight plays. It was the symbolism, the depth with which his journey resonated across different contexts. It was about a boy rejected for how he looked, who triumphed without revenge, who offered a hand where he had received a shove. The scenes in the documentary showed much more than basketball moves. They revealed inner journeys, healing processes, acceptance, resilience. With every image, a mirror was held up, and thousands of young people around the world saw themselves in him. There was something deeply educational in all of it, not as an imposed lesson, but as a spontaneous revelation. This is the kind of content that teaches without shouting, that educates without pointing fingers, that invites reflection without shaming. And maybe that's why the film spread so powerfully. It didn't demand agreement. It invited feeling, recognition, memory. Because all of us have been, or still are, Caio in some part of life. We all carry invisible parts that only become powerful when someone dares to see with their heart. That's why sharing stories like this is an act of transformation. Today, teachers use the film as a pedagogical tool. In classrooms, the documentary becomes both a pause and a starting point. Topics like bullying, self-esteem, empathy, prejudice, social media, and belonging are discussed. Parents watch it alongside their children. Psychologists recommend it for therapeutic groups. Professional athletes send messages of support. Even acclaimed sports figures have admitted they were moved. Some even confessed they almost gave up early in their careers because they felt exactly like Caio, out of place. But perhaps the most moving part is that Caio didn't change because of the fame. He still had the same calm gaze, the same soft voice, the same twilight training sessions. He didn't dress like a celebrity, didn't speak like a motivational speaker, didn't act like a star. He was simply someone who had understood, far too early, that the true pinnacle isn't the spotlight, it's the purpose. That it's not about the stage, it's about the roots. That true impact isn't measured in likes, but in the silences we manage to fill with meaning. Stories like his aren't written to become trends, they're written to become memory. And if he left us with one legacy, it's that the invisible also has color, also has strength, also has a voice. Caio always knew the world is easily distracted by superficial shine, but it's in the shadows where true light learns to grow. He wasn't looking for revenge, he was looking for meaning, and that's precisely why he became a symbol, by not wanting to be one. by not trying to be an example, but living so authentically that he became a natural reference. During a talk at a school on the outskirts of São Paulo, someone asked what he would do differently if he could go back in time. He paused, then said, "Nothing, because even the pain taught me to listen to myself." The room fell silent. It wasn't a rehearsed answer. It was a lived one. And in that silence, another story was born. Because sometimes, only when we quiet the world, can we hear the truth that pulses within us. The success of the documentary opened doors. Caio received invitations to participate in educational campaigns, partner with NGOs, and lead inclusion projects in underserved communities. But he chose something simpler. He created a foundation focused on invisible youth. It offers scholarships for sports activities, psychological care, and creative expression workshops. The name of the institution? Living Stories. Because, as he says, every human being carries a story that just needs space to bloom. And that may be the biggest message of all. It's not about winning to silence others. It's about winning to hear yourself, about turning scars into bridges, about looking in the mirror and recognizing not a flaw, but a beginning. Caio taught us that a reflection is not a sentence, it's a sign that there is something beyond the surface, a sign that every mocking laugh, every look of contempt, every imposed silence can become the frame for a great story if you choose to write it with the pen of courage. So if you've made it this far, maybe there's also something inside you that's waiting to be revealed. Maybe there's a part of your story you're still hiding, afraid it won't be accepted. But remember, no great journey ever began with applause. They all started with a no that hurt, that wounded, that left you in silence. But it's from that silence that the truest voices are born. Voices that don't beg for an audience. They simply exist and transform. Caio learned early that the mirror can be a silent enemy, because it wasn't the glass that wounded him. It was the eyes of others reflected there, distorting who he was. His face bore marks, not of flaws, but of process. Every pimple, every imperfection, was like a comma in his own construction. But no one wanted to read carefully. They just pointed, they mocked, they labeled. And him? He stayed silent, not because he believed what they said, but because he knew he was growing. And growth is often noisy on the inside and quiet on the outside. The appearance he carried, so harshly judged, wasn't a flaw. It was a shell, and like all shells, it existed to protect something still maturing. The problem is the world has no patience for unripe fruit. It wants beauty before essence, packaging before substance. But Caio was never about the surface. While they mocked his face, he shaped his mind. While they laughed at his body, he trained his spirit, because he knew that sooner or later, what no one could see would bloom. And when it did, no one would be able to pretend not to notice. And that's exactly what happened. Without anyone realizing, Caio had already become whole, with self-esteem forged in silence, with purpose stitched between rejections, with character refined in solitude. He understood that stories don't need to fit in other people's eyes. They exist to expand our own, to show that there is life beyond what the eyes can see, and that the judgment of others is far too fragile to define someone's worth. The most provocative part is realizing how hard they tried to stop him before he even began, before his first project, his first idea, his first real chance. It's like trying to silence a song before its first note, as if appearance could define destiny, as if talent could be measured by skin, clothes, or the symmetry of a smile. How many other Caios are out there, swallowing their light because someone said they don't look like champions? That question burns, and it needs to burn. Because this isn't just about one boy and his personal battle, it's about thousands of stories that could have been written, but were shelved because of prejudice. Caio, however, chose not to stay silent. He chose not to fit in. He chose not to wait for the world's acceptance to begin truly existing. Because the greatest stories don't ask for permission, they happen in spite of closed doors. And that, in spite of, makes all the difference. It separates those who merely survive from those who truly live. Because to live, truly live, takes courage. And Caio had it. Not because he was a hero, but because he refused to accept the role of a victim. The most beautiful truth of all is that Caio never wanted to be remembered as the boy who overcame bullying. That would be too small. He wanted to be remembered as the man who gave meaning to pain, who turned mockery into learning, who built bridges where there had once been walls, who looked back not with resentment but with gratitude, because he understood that even pain can teach, and even tears have a place of honor in our stories. The difference between trauma and transformation lies exactly in that, in how we choose to tell our own story. Pain doesn't disappear just because it's been overcome, but it changes roles. From villain, it can become mentor. From wound, it can become scar. And a scar is not shameful, it's a sign of healing. Caio chose to write his story with purpose. No molds, no retouching, no filters, just truth. And it's that choice that transforms lives, including yours. And maybe that's what unsettles those who judged him the most, realizing that the strength he built came precisely from the weaknesses they mocked. He didn't succeed in spite of the criticism. He succeeded because he allowed himself to grow through it. And today, every time he tells his story, it's not to provoke revenge, it's to provoke awareness. Because he knows his story is not just his own. It belongs to everyone who's ever felt invisible, unworthy, or out of place. Everyone who's ever heard, "You're not good enough, you can't, you don't belong." For them, Caio has become a lighthouse, a reminder that no one needs applause to begin, that the stage can be real life, and that all it takes is courage to take the first step, even if it's shaky. Because every story begins with someone who decides to move forward, even without guarantees. Someone who chooses to trust, not what they see in the mirror, but what they feel in their heart. And that, no one can take away. The most poetic part is that over time, the same school hallways where he was once ignored became the backdrop for reunions. The ones who mocked him now admire him. The ones who dismissed him now ask how he did it. And he answers simply, "I didn't make it, I kept going." Because true victory isn't about impressing, it's about persisting. And persistence isn't about strength, it's about faith. Faith in your own story. Faith that you are not what they said. Faith that something inside you is waiting to be revealed. Today, Caio doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. His worth no longer depends on likes, on claps, on external validation. He's learned to validate himself, to respect himself, to love himself, and that self-love which sprouted in the dry soil of rejection is now what sustains him. It's what pushes him to keep inspiring other stories, to show that appearance is not a sentence, that labels are not destiny, that pain can be the raw material for great creations. And that's why this story needs to be told, not as a fairy tale but as a cry of freedom, a reminder that even when everything seems to say no, you can still say yes to yourself, because in the end, you are the one writing the script. And if the pen is still in your hand, the page is never lost. Your story can be rewritten, today, now, with courage and truth. So if you've ever felt like Caio, if you've ever believed your appearance holds you back, or if you've ever swallowed your voice out of fear, how many times have you caught yourself thinking you're not enough, just because someone decided to judge you by your looks? How many times has that internal voice, born in the classroom, in the mirror, in cruel comments, still convinced you to shrink, to doubt, to hide? You're not alone. Caio's story is more than inspiring. It's a mirror, and maybe a map, because it shows that it doesn't matter how you start. What matters is what you do with what they tried to use to tear you down. Caio was a teenager like many, shy, full of dreams, but pushed to the margins. His appearance? Acne-covered, crooked teeth, glasses taped together. Enough for others to become a joke. And when they weren't laughing, they were ignoring. The hallway laughs, the disdainful glances, the whispered comments, all of it quietly accumulated inside him. But instead of exploding or giving up, Caio chose another path, building. And that's why this story is pure gold. While the world said, "You're not good enough," he started serving himself. His training sessions, on the cracked school court, had no audience, just purpose. Every drop of sweat was a no turned into fuel. Every missed shot, a chance to learn. And every step on that worn-out court was a manifesto. I'm not what they say about me. I'm what I choose to be. So here's the question that won't go away. How many stories like Caio's are you ignoring, including your own? Maybe you also have a cracked concrete court in your life, a simple, invisible place but full of potential, a gift no one sees, a talent that hasn't had its stage yet, a courage hidden beneath layers of fear. And if you start now, in silence, in humility, step by step, who knows if that's not the beginning of your turning point? Because no one is born ready, but everyone is born with the chance to build themselves. The difference is who insists. You don't need their approval to begin. You need yours. You need to look inside and decide that this pain will no longer paralyze you. It will move you. That the labels placed on you are not sentences, but provocations. That being different is not a flaw. It's a chance to leave your mark. Because true stories aren't written with what the world gives you, but with what you do with what the world denies you. And that's what Caio did. He turned mockery into practice, prejudice into performance, silence into results. And you know what's most symbolic? When the turning point finally arrived, when he was chosen to represent the school at the state tournament, no one could understand where all that talent had come from. But Caio knew. It came from hidden tears. From the no's he swallowed. From the nights he stayed late, alone on the court, while everyone else had gone home. It came from his decision not to seek revenge, but to reinvent himself. And you? What have you done with your no's? With your judgments? With the parts of yourself no one seems to value? Maybe that's where your gold is. Your edge. Your place of becoming. Because the world will try to shape you, label you, push you into a mold. But those with stories don't fit in molds. Those with truth overflow. And if you still doubt that, maybe it's time to stop asking for permission and start writing your own version. Will you keep accepting labels, or will you start writing your story with courage? Will you keep waiting to be validated, or will you rise and validate yourself, even without applause? Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't silencing others. It's listening to yourself with respect. It's looking in the mirror and saying, I'm proud of myself, even if the world doesn't yet understand what I'm building. And here's a sincere invitation. If this story touched you, if it stirred something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment below. Tell me, what part of your story are you still hiding? What pain, what gift, what power are you delaying because you're afraid you won't be accepted? Because when you share, you inspire. And sometimes your vulnerability is what begins healing in someone else. And of course, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that true worth is never just about appearance. It's about character, effort, authenticity, and most of all, the courage to keep going, even when no one believes. Because that's how the strongest stories are born, in the silence of effort, not in the noise of validation. You may have started as a background character, but those who choose to become protagonists are sooner or later seen and respected.